Hello, BillWhittle.com members. I'm Steve Green with Bill Whittle and Scott Ott, and this is your members only lightning round. Are you excited? I'm excited.
Good.
I can feel the
Good.
excitement. Scott doesn't look excited. No.
It's good.
You keep telling yourself that. Wait till you see the stories I picked for you this week. So you know how the lightning round works. I spend 2 or 3 weeks collecting stories that might not be big enough for a full segment, but are entertaining or enlightening or just plain weird. And I kind of laid off the weird this week. You're in for an easy time, fellas. All right, let's start with you, Scott. Yeah, I love this story. My wife found this to me and sent it to me last week. Lifelong famous atheist Bill Hayden, I believe he's Australia, receives Jesus at age 85. Now, my wife, who is not religious or spiritual, if you're familiar with that little cop-out, she forwarded this to me and said, in her cynical way, "Oh, sure, everybody finds Jesus at 85. What about at 25? And I thought, you know what? I believe it. How about you, Scott?
Wait a minute. I'm just consulting my list of famous atheists. Didn't see his name on there.
Dude, that was brilliant.
I'm not exactly familiar with the gentleman. However, I'm excited when anybody comes to faith in Christ, obviously. I mean, that's my whole job for the remaining time on earth, is to help people do that, to join the choir, so to speak. I think that it's natural to be skeptical of another person's profession of faith, especially if you got to spend any time around them. It's really easy when somebody comes to faith in Christ. They're like, "Oh yeah, he's such a good guy now. You know, he's got Jesus and everything." It's like, no. He's still a rotten sinner, but he's saved by grace. You know, the whole concept of Christianity is not that you find Jesus and suddenly you're a good person, but rather that the Lord has chosen to pay for your sin so that you might have fellowship with God. And so I'm hoping that this is legitimate with this guy, but I make no evaluation of that. When I was pastor of a little church in Missouri, I was frequently called upon to preach at funerals. And there's a tendency at funerals to deify the dead. Whoever he was, no matter how he behaved in this life, no matter what kind of rancor he generated, for some reason we choose to assume that he's now, dancing with the angels and looking down on all of us and smiling benevolently at us. I never engage in that kind of talk, frankly, because it's beyond my knowledge. There's no way that I can stare into eternity and be able to evaluate the condition of somebody else's soul. So basically what I did when I was asked to, preach the funeral of literally a guy who froze to death on his front porch because he couldn't find his front door because he'd been drinking so heavily. In those kinds of situations, I just tried to love the people and share Jesus with them. And I am hoping that that's exactly what somebody did for this lifelong atheist. And it is, if you started to look at the roles of professing Christians now, you'd find a lot of former atheists, people who, when they started to look into it, said, "Hey, wait a minute. The evidence for this Jesus character being the Messiah is a lot stronger than I ever suspected." And so they actually start looking into it for themselves instead of just listening to the cultural narrative that's pushed by the media and people who oppose Christianity. So if that happened, that's awesome. If it didn't, just the fact that this story is out there now and that people are hearing again about a Jesus who came to save even filthy, rotten atheists and people like me, which I don't know why I made the distinction there. But in any case, that's awesome, and I'm glad to hear it.
Indeed. There's a final Jewish tradition law that you are supposed to speak nothing but the truth of the recently deceased, and that can be a lot of fun. Bill, this one's for you. Not all heroes wear capes. A South African man was arrested for eating at KFC for free for a year by saying the head office had sent him to taste if they were up to standard. Now, instead of arresting this guy, instead of pressing charges, don't you think KFC should hire this guy as a spokesman?
Absolutely. He certainly doesn't bring as much baggage with him as Jared did. This is one of those cases, and I think Americans are probably more tolerant of this kind of thing than anybody in the world, at least tolerant about it in the right way. I mean, the guy's stealing lunches. He's eating food he didn't pay for. And to say, well, there's no harm, this is the same argument as saying, well, we're going to award somebody $100 million because the insurance company is going to pay for it. That doesn't wash with me either. But the one thing I think that that most Americans admire is they admire people with imagination and guts. And if they pull off a caper and nobody gets seriously hurt, then the cleverer the caper, the more sympathetic to them that we are. I am inclined to want to say, if he ate there for a year before the local manager called the office, it's kind of a case of fooled me once, shame on you. Fooled me 365 times consecutively, shame on me, and that has a part of it to do too. But seriously, I don't want to say that the office is culpable because the office didn't commit the crime, but as crimes go, I can think of a few people higher on the list that I would like to see brought to the sword and scales of justice than this guy, who basically did something pretty harmless. And you were talking about superheroes and capes. The one thing that's not going mentioned in this story is just how much just raw courage it takes to eat at Kentucky Fried Chicken every day for a year. And just that alone is admirable.
I'll bet at the end of the first week, if he missed a day, they would call him up and go, "Hey, are you coming in today?"
Yep. We got your bucket waiting for you.
We've already got it waiting for you. That's right.
I love it. Scott, this one's to you. Oh, this is a headline from Car and Driver that I saw and immediately thought of you. It's called "The Thrill of Analog, the Agony of Digital. Mechanical driving experiences." We're talking about stick shifts. We're talking about actual needles that move back and forth, and all of that are now a luxury. And you can expect to pay extra to have actual things that move instead of an HD screen plastered all over your dashboard. And I look at your collection back there, right behind you, and I just wanted to get your comment on that.
I wish I could reach it here, but maybe I can. Underneath this typewriter, there is the bill that I paid to have that 1918 Royal typewriter as well as a 1947 Smith Corona fixed. The most recent time, it's $212 that I paid to have that done by this guy who is in Greenville, Texas, and he's like the last guy in Texas who fixes typewriters or something. It was really a whole creepy story about that, but I won't go into that. Only to say that when I was back in Pennsylvania, I stopped by a shop that also repaired typewriters, and I was taken for a tour of the store where they sold old restored typewriters for $4,000,
Whoa.
for $5,000, for things like that. And I said, well, wow, that's a lot of money for a typewriter. First of all, who buys these? And he said, mostly people who don't type. Mostly people who want to put them on their desks, and it's a novelty. And the other thing is, the reason it's so expensive to do, and it was at that time, it was $90 to have your typewriter diagnosed. Then they would decide what to do with it. It's because
they're practically veterinarians.
Yeah,
these people.
But this company that was doing that was a company that used to have a truck that drove around town and maintained typewriters in people's offices. So they would pull up outside, they would come in, they would clean keys, they would replace typewriter ribbons, they would replace platens that had grown hard through aging. That was the business. Instead of going out of business like every other shop that did that, they made that transition into turning a typewriter into something that wasn't just a practical machine, but was something that was a collector's item. In addition to typewriters, by the way, that shop back in Pennsylvania machined by themselves staplers after a design that you've probably never seen. The stapler, when you press the top of the stapler, actually draws a brass wire from a spool that you can see that draws this brass wire in, cuts it to size, inserts it in the paper, bends it, and then pulls back up again. And so you've got this big spool of brass wire that's feeding into this thing. $900 for a stapler.
But I bet it staples like nothing else out there.
And I Love it. I mean, look at this. I've got by the way, the phone on the wall is a fake phone. It's actually a radio that was built in the 1950s. It's a novelty. I had that restored, though, and they couldn't do it with vacuum tubes, so I had it restored solid state. But the telephone on my other side up there, that's a real telephone. That actually works. If I plug it into a jack and I have home phone service, which I haven't had since 2004, it actually works. The problem is if somebody else picks up another line, that phone draws so much power or whatever it is, that the magic that makes that possible, that the person on the other line can't hear anything. So this is, and plus there's no dial. You have to like tap on it and go, hey, Matilda, can you connect me with Bertha? In any case, I am completely immersed in this analog world and love it, even though I'm sitting here with a 27-inch iMac next to me.
Yeah, years ago, I think I was in high school, I saw this interview or I read this book with Linda Ellerby, who did various...
I remember her.
Yeah, various TV news shows, and I always liked her on air. And I remember, it was her biography. I read this thing, her memoir. The first year that she was on whatever that late night news show she was with that guy, she had this typewriter on the desk, and she was always leaning on the thing. And apparently it's because she was terrified being on TV. She started off as a print journalist, and so she literally was clinging onto this typewriter, trying to look relaxed. And you can't do that with something like this.
What a metaphor.
Really, Bill, let's go to you. Oh, I love this story. Just love this story. In a first, Trump's ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, requests $0 more in his budget and cut spending. Can we get more men like him, please?
Well, we have had men like him. There was an ambassador to Germany, to Hitler's Germany. I forget his first name. His last name was Dodd. And he was a Jeffersonian Democrat, had his own farm. FDR gave him the appointment because so many other people turned it down. And I forget what the salary was, but it was something like, I want to say, $117,000 a year. But he had to run the embassy functions out of that money. And he said to FDR, I'm going to live within my means, and he did. So he took his Chevy over to Germany by boat. And in a world where these Nazi bigwigs would arrive in Mercedes, chauffeur-driven, big, enormous black Mercedes, this guy drove himself up in a Chevy and put on little, almost like weenie roast kind of diplomatic events. I'm exaggerating a little bit there, and that's admirable, and it's certainly admirable what this guy did. Although I suspect he's probably got more to run the embassy on than $117,000 a year, but there is something to be said about this. Frugality is great, and it's a great quality in your own life, and it's a great, as long as it doesn't turn into being miserly. Yeah. But frugality is a great quality. But there are times when money needs to be spent, and there are a few times when money needs to be spent extravagantly. And as it turns out, 1934 Germany was one of the times when the United States should have spent money extravagantly, not to try to match the Nazis in terms of their opulence, but to simply make it clear to them that this country is not a haven for gentlemen farmers. This place produces cars, radios, refrigerators, washing machines, and munitions at a rate that you can't even imagine. That's just a question of dealing with thugs and people who look for these kind of signals. Saw Dodd and saw weakness when Dodd should have just made it crystal clear to them that you are dealing with the most powerful economy in the world, and here's some evidence of it, and think twice about whether you want to get involved with us. But, of course, that would assume that the Nazis were rational, so that argument goes out the window.
Probably not. It would be an interesting experiment if we could go back in time just once. All right, folks, I'm about to completely obliterate 10 years making these shows with Bill and Scott, and 16, 17 years, whatever it is, of blogging, and say to you, I have found definitive proof that progressives are the smartest people in the world and that our brain power will never match theirs. And I got this, believe it or not, from
Do tell.
Yeah, from Matt Walsh on Twitter. And even though he's a conservative, he made this all very, very clear to me. I'm going to share this tweet with you. He wrote, Gender is a social construct, but I am woman, hear me roar. But anyone can be a woman, but no uterus, no opinion. But trans women are women, but I demand women's rights. But men are women, but men are scum. But drag queens are beautiful, but appropriation is evil. And if you can hold all of these things in your brain at the same time, as a progressive must, clearly you have a brain big enough to encapsulate the entire multiverse, and your brain power truly dwarfs those of us who are mere mortals. And that is your members only right angle, brought to you by you. Thank you so much. Thanks to Bill and Scott for being here again and again and again this week as I've worked out some tech problems. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.